What's good, everyone? How's it going? Today's video, we're going to be learning about different branches of our nervous system. So we're going to be learning about the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, which can be split into the parasympathetic pathway and the sympathetic pathway. So let's get into it. Let's learn about our body's nervous system. Now, before we get into this video, the past couple of videos, we've learned a lot about different types of neurotransmitters such as dopamine, acetylcholine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. This video relies really heavily on all of those messenger molecules. All of those messenger molecules are involved in your somatic and parasympathetic and sympathetic pathways. So it's really important to understand those concepts first before moving on to this video. So I'd really recommend watching those videos first. I'll link them all down below in the description. But if you're feeling confident in knowing all about those messenger molecules, then let's get into it. Another thing I wanted to mention before we got into it, I'm going to use a lot of diagrams and information sources from my first year cell bio course, which was taught by my two great professors, Professor Eric and Shari. Wanted to give them a shout out because it felt wrong to just use their work for my video without thanking them. But yeah, these resources really helped me learn throughout my first year, and I'm hoping that I can use them to help teach you guys as well. So our body's nervous system is split up as shown below. So your nervous system can be split into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is where a lot of the core, important, in-depth processing happens. So it consists of the spine and the brain. And then the peripheral nervous system is basically the relay station or the connection between your central nervous system and the rest of your body. So you can see in this person here, I've drawn out the central nervous system, your brain and your spine. This is where all the core processing happens. But your central nervous system has to be able to communicate with the rest of your body, such as, like neurons and receptors on your hands, on your feet, or other organs throughout your body. And that's the job of the peripheral nervous system. It can relay signals from, let's say, your limbs to the central nervous system. Then this information gets processed, and then it relays responses back out from your central nervous system to the rest of your body. So the peripheral nervous system is basically the messenger system between the central nervous system and the rest of your body, which consists of organs, limbs, muscles, glands, and many other things. So now the peripheral nervous system, it can be broken down even further into the somatic and autonomic nervous system. As the name suggests, autonomic nervous system is automatic. It's involuntary. We don't have control over it, or it's things that we don't have to think about or control. They just happen automatically. So like, let's say sweating, digestion, heart rates. And usually, autonomic responses involve smooth muscles. Smooth muscles are found in organs like your stomach or your intestines, things that just happen without you having to think about it. On the other hand, somatic nervous system is basically all the stuff that you can control. So, gestures, movements. Somatic nervous system is voluntary, meaning it's controllable, and it usually involves skeletal muscle. So unlike smooth muscle, skeletal muscle is muscles that attach to your skeleton and that we can consciously think about moving them and, control them. So for example, muscles in our hands and our feet, we can move them at will, we can control it. Therefore, it's voluntary and it's part of your somatic nervous system. So just to recap that, nervous system can be split into central, which is spine and brain, and peripheral, which connects the central nervous system to the rest of the body, and then peripheral can be further divided into the autonomic involuntary system and the somatic voluntary system. So your autonomic nervous system, it can actually be split up even further. As you can see, it can be split up into your parasympathetic and sympathetic pathways. So when you're just chilling and your body's at rest, then your parasympathetic pathway is active. Therefore, it's known as the rest and digest state. So at this state, your body's on low alert mode. So functions like breathing, digestion, heart rate, they can all happen normally. So here's a useful diagram outlining some of the differences between your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic, remember this is the low alert mode, rest and digest state when you're just chilling. So your eyes are constricted, your salivary glands are working, and as well as your stomach and your liver and your intestines, they're all working together to allow for digestion. Your bladder is constricted, which allows for urination. Your heartbeat is nice and slow and relaxed because, you're just chilling. And your lungs, bronchi, which is the airways of your lungs, they're constricted. So it allows air to flow through, but not a crazy amount of air because you don't need to breathe as fast. You're resting. So that's your parasympathetic pathway. But you also have your sympathetic pathway. So your sympathetic nervous system, it instead activates when you're facing danger. So let's say you're being attacked, right? You have two options. You can either run away or you can fight back. And that's where this term comes from, fight or flight. The sympathetic nervous system controls your fight or flight response. And in order to be able to run away or fight back, your body's senses need to be heightened. So, your vision needs to be very acute to see what's going on. You need more energy, so your heart rate's going to have to increase. Your breathing rate's going to have to increase. And things that are not as important, such as digestion or urination, they can be put on pause temporarily until we've escaped the danger. So going back to our diagram, you can see that our eye in the sympathetic nervous system, our eyes, they dilate, the pupils dilate, so that allows for more perception. Salivary glands, they inhibit salivation, stomach inhibits digestion, and this is because digestion isn't as important. Similarly, your bladder relaxes, which prevents urination because urination is not also important. We can worry about digestion and going pee after we've escaped the danger. For now, let's just respond to the threat. On the other hand, your heart rate increases so that you're able to, have the energy to respond to the threat. And your lungs, bronchi, which is the airways of your lungs, they dilate to allow for more air entering your lungs so you can have more oxygen and more energy. Some other important things to note is that your liver stimulates the release of glucose because glucose is your body's main source of energy. And your kidneys stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Remember, these are the messenger molecules that we talked about in our last couple episodes. Now, the reasons why epinephrine and acetylcholine and norepinephrine are so important is because they are very much responsible for controlling your parasympathetic and sympathetic pathways. So your messenger molecules of norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine are very heavily involved with your sympathetic nervous system. A lot of the responses of these messenger molecules, such as, so let's say when these messenger molecules go and bind onto receptors, right, and produce responses, a lot of those responses are the ones that you see here as part of your sympathetic nervous system. That's why these messenger molecules are very important for the sympathetic nervous system, and that's why your kidneys stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. On the other hand, your parasympathetic nervous system is more so reliant on your messenger molecule acetylcholine. So acetylcholine's responses include some of these things that you see here. One thing to note is that acetylcholine often causes muscles to contract, whereas norepinephrine and epinephrine, they often cause muscles to relax or dilate. And we can see these effects in the responses of our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So our parasympathetic nervous system, which mostly relies on acetylcholine, its responses include the constriction of your pupils, the constriction of your bronchi, the contraction of your bladder, lots of constrictive or contractive muscle responses which are associated with acetylcholine. On the other hand, if you look at your sympathetic nervous system, responses include dilation of your pupils, dilation and relaxation of your bronchi, relaxation of your bladder. So the relaxation of muscles is very commonly seen in your sympathetic nervous system, and this is associated with norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are involved in your sympathetic nervous system. Now, there are exceptions. Sometimes acetylcholine might cause relaxation. Sometimes norepinephrine and epinephrine might cause contraction. It's not always like this, but this is a common trend seen between these messenger molecules. So acetylcholine and norepinephrine can actually sometimes work against each other. For example, for your body's airways, acetylcholine can cause your airways to contract and make breathing more difficult, whereas norepinephrine and epinephrine can cause your airways to relax and allow more air to enter your lungs. So basically, Your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are two branches of your autonomic nervous system, and they work together in order to regulate your body's conditions to adapt to various different scenarios. Okay, so now that we understand the difference between our somatic and autonomic nervous system, and we understand how our autonomic nervous system is broken down into these two distinct pathways, we can now take a look at this diagram. This diagram can really help us understand how our different messenger molecules, such as you can see here acetylcholine and norepinephrine and dopamine, how they are involved with our different pathways and let them all work. So before we get into it, let's break this down. At the bottom here, we have our somatic nervous system. That's the one that we are in control of. It's voluntary. And then the rest of the pathways are all part of the autonomic, which is the involuntary automatic nervous system. And then within your autonomic nervous system, at the top here, this is your parasympathetic nervous system. And then these four are all a part of your sympathetic nervous system. Just a reminder, parasympathetic, that is your rest and digest pathway, and your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight pathway. So as you mentioned before, your central nervous system is where a lot of the core processing happens, and your peripheral nervous system is basically the communication between your central nervous system and the rest of your body. And we can see that in this diagram. On the left side here, you have your spinal cord, which is a part of your central nervous system. And then you have all these peripheral neurons, which allow for communication between your central nervous system and your different muscles and glands. So they allow for signals to be passed from your central nervous system to your muscles and to your glands, so that your muscles and glands can produce responses associated with your parasympathetic, sympathetic, or somatic nervous systems. So the parasympathetic neurons, not parasympathetic neurons, the peripheral neurons allow for communication between your central nervous system and the many organs of your body that are going to produce the responses. So as you may notice, in the pathways of our autonomic nervous system, we have these junction sites between different neurons. So here we have a junction, here we have these junctions that lie in between our first and our second neurons. So what are these junctions? We call these junctions ganglia. Ganglia plural or ganglion singular. So these ganglia lie between your pre and post ganglionic neurons. Preganglionic and postganglionic. Now the messenger molecules that are released between your pre and postganglionic neurons, they can stay the same or they can change. So here, your preganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine, and your postganglionic neuron is also releasing acetylcholine, so it's staying the same. Whereas here, your preganglionic neuron is releasing acetylcholine, and then after your ganglion, your postganglionic neuron is releasing norepinephrine, so that messenger molecule is changing. And depending on, what the messenger molecules that your postganglionic neuron is releasing, whether it's acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, or something else, it can go to different receptors and produce different responses. Another thing to note is that whenever acetylcholine is released at your preganglionic neuron, it goes and binds to nicotinic neuronal receptors at your ganglion. So if you remember in our original video about acetylcholine, we learned that acetylcholine can go and bind onto nicotinic or muscarinic receptors. And nicotinic receptors, basically it involves the opening of ion channels. And there's two types of nicotinic receptors, neuromuscular junctions and neuronal type. And this is the type at hand. This is the type that we find at our ganglions. So when acetylcholine is released from our preganglionic neuron, it goes and binds onto nicotinic neuronal receptors, and in doing so, it opens up ion channels that allows ions to come and enter our postganglionic neuron and depolarize it, triggering action potentials and stimulating the release of other messenger molecules such as acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And that's how signals are relayed from our preganglionic to our postganglionic neuron. They all rely on the binding of acetylcholine to your nicotinic neuronal receptors to activate your postganglionic neurons. So now that we understand how ganglia work, let's now take a look at each of our pathways, starting with the somatic nervous system, as it's the simplest. So from your central nervous system, your spine / your brain, you have peripheral neurons coming out, and these peripheral neurons, they release acetylcholine. Now acetylcholine goes and binds onto NMJ, or neuromuscular junction type receptors. So remember this chart from before. Acetylcholine can bind onto nicotinic receptors, which are involved with ion channels, and this type of nicotinic receptor, NMJ, stands for neuromuscular junction. So as the name suggests, it's the junction between a neuron and a muscle, and that's exactly what we have here. It's a junction between a neuron and a muscle. So acetylcholine goes and binds onto these neuromuscular junction receptors, and in doing so, it opens up ion channels for ions to come in and depolarize your muscle and cause muscle contraction. And that's how we're able to control the contraction of movement of your skeletal muscles. Remember that your somatic nervous system is the one that we control. It's voluntary, and it's involved in skeletal muscles, which helps us produce movement. Skeletal muscles includes muscles on our arms and our feet and our hands and our legs. And this works via acetylcholine, which binds onto NMJ nicotinic receptors. That's basically your somatic nervous system. Let's now look at our autonomic nervous system, starting with our parasympathetic pathway up here at the top. So as we said before, your parasympathetic nervous system relies mostly on the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and we can see that as your preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, and your postganglionic neuron also releases acetylcholine, which goes over to various different smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, glands, and other effector organs to produce responses. And acetylcholine basically goes and binds onto muscarinic receptors, as indicated by the letter M here. So that's a big distinction from what we saw with the somatic nervous system. Here, acetylcholine goes and binds onto nicotinic neuromuscular junctions, whereas with your parasympathetic system, acetylcholine binds onto muscarinic receptors. So, going back to our chart, remember that whereas nicotinic receptors open ion channels, muscarinic receptors are GPCRs, and when acetylcholine binds onto them, they activate various G proteins that can produce responses. So when acetylcholine goes and binds onto these muscarinic receptors, it can produce responses that we saw in our parasympathetic pathway, such as the constriction of pupils, the slowing down of your heartbeats, the constriction of bronchi, stimulating digestion, and there are other things. Another thing to note is that, as you can see, acetylcholine goes and binds onto muscarinic receptors found in your cardiac and smooth muscles, because cardiac and smooth muscles are involuntary. We don't have control over them. We can't control our heartbeat or how digestion happens. And that makes sense because our parasympathetic system is a part of our autonomic nervous system, which is out of our control. It's involuntary. On the other hand, with your somatic nervous system, remember that your acetylcholine instead bound to receptors on skeletal muscles, because skeletal muscles are muscles that we can control and consciously move. So that's a big difference between the somatic, or voluntary, and parasympathetic, which is involuntary. Moving on to the second half of our autonomic nervous system, here we have the sympathetic pathway. Similarly to your parasympathetic pathway, acetylcholine goes and binds onto your ganglia at these nicotinic neuronal receptors. But what's different is that after your ganglia, your postganglionic neurons are not limited to just releasing acetylcholine. In fact, while they can release acetylcholine, they often don't. They often release other messenger molecules such as norepinephrine and dopamine that can go on and bind to different receptors in various glands and muscles and tissues to produce various different responses. The only thing that acetylcholine does in your sympathetic nervous system is produce sweats at your sweat glands. All other responses are produced by norepinephrine or dopamine or other messenger molecules. And that's why we said that the sympathetic nervous system is more so reliant on norepinephrine and dopamine, and not so much acetylcholine, because acetylcholine only does sweat. Everything else, like, inhibition of salivation, dilation of pupils, faster heart rate, dilation of bronchi, inhibiting digestion, relaxation of bladder, everything else is produced by, at least most of them are produced by norepinephrine and dopamine. Acetylcholine is not as involved in your sympathetic nervous system. As you can see, just like with your parasympathetic nervous system, acetylcholine goes and binds onto muscarinic receptors, which activates G proteins. So you may have also noticed this down here. This is also part of your sympathetic nervous system, and similarly to the other pathways, you have acetylcholine, which goes over to something called the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla is a type of ganglion, but it's special because this is where norepinephrine can get turned into epinephrine. One thing I should have mentioned before, actually. Norepinephrine is the same thing as noradrenaline, and epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline. The names are interchangeable with each other, but basically at the site, the adrenal medulla, norepinephrine gets turned into epinephrine, or noradrenaline gets turned into adrenaline. So what's the difference between norepinephrine and epinephrine? Well, unlike norepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter, epinephrine is a neurohormone. That means that it can travel through the blood instead of across a synapse, and it can travel for much further distances. So let's say it's necessary to send a messenger molecule over a much further distance from one side of the body to another, then norepinephrine can come over to adrenal medulla and get transformed into epinephrine for this purpose. And it's turned into epinephrine via the addition of a methyl group. So just like with your other autonomic ganglia, acetylcholine is released from your preganglionic neuron, and it comes and binds onto nicotinic neuronal receptors at your adrenal medulla. And when it does so, it activates the adrenal medulla, and then this process can take place. The methyl group can be added to your norepinephrine to turn it into epinephrine, and then your epinephrine gets released. It can travel through the blood long distances and go over to different receptors on different organs and produce responses. So that basically covers all our pathways, but I understand that we went through a lot of information, so let's do a recap real quick. So your nervous system can be split into the autonomic, which is the automatic and voluntary nervous system, and the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary and not automatic. We are in control of it. Somatic nervous system, basically acetylcholine goes and binds onto nicotinic neuromuscular junction receptors found at skeletal muscles that we can control. And with our autonomic nervous system, you have these things called autonomic ganglia, which are these relay stations, these junctions. And at these relay stations, acetylcholine goes and binds onto nicotinic neuronal receptors. So similar to these receptors, except instead of a neuromuscular junction, it's a neuronal type nicotinic receptor. And then after your ganglions, for your parasympathetic system, which relies more on acetylcholine can go and bind onto muscarinic receptors, which are GPCRs, and produce various different responses in various different organs or tissues. And then with your sympathetic nervous system, after your ganglion, your postganglionic neuron can release acetylcholine, but not often, only for sweating responses. For all the other responses, it relies on other things such as norepinephrine or dopamine or epinephrine for more long-distance signaling. And just to review this part, adrenal medulla is a type of autonomic ganglion that acetylcholine can go and activate via these nicotinic neuronal receptors. And when it's activated, your norepinephrine can be turned into epinephrine, which produces very similar responses, except that it travels through the blood and it can travel for much further distances. So depending on the scenario, sometimes you want norepinephrine, sometimes you want epinephrine, and the adrenal medulla allows for this flexibility. And that basically covers the different pathways of our nervous system and the different messenger molecules that are involved. So that basically wraps up this video. I hope you were able to get a better understanding of the differences between our somatic and autonomic nervous system, how the autonomic nervous system is divided into our parasympathetic and sympathetic pathways, how the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways work together to regulate our body under different circumstances and scenarios, and how messenger molecules like acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and epinephrine all work together to bind onto different receptors and produce all your necessary responses. So in the next video, we're going to look at some common toxins and toxic chemicals and things that can interfere with these processes and potentially cause harm to a human body or even death. This basically laid out the foundation of your nervous system. In the next episode, we're going to look at how chemicals can mess things up and how things can go wrong. But until then, I really hope you guys enjoy the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all the support. If you find anything confusing or you want me to go over anything again or maybe make a video on something specific, please leave a comment down below. I'll make sure to check them all out and I'm happy to take any feedback. But other than that, thank you again for watching. I'll see y'all next time. Take care.